Okay. Thanks everybody for joining us for today's webinar. I'm really excited to talk about this topic, and with the folks we've got here today. Cyber insurance has been something that has become a ridiculous amount of my job as a CISO over the last couple of years, where we spend more and more time talking about it. And I think we'll be able to dig in today with the folks we've got here and answer some good questions about that, and hopefully help all of you understand a little bit better what's going on, where it's really headed towards, and maybe some of the landmines that are laying ahead for you that you aren't aware of yet, but that some of us have already stepped on. So we'll be able to give you a little insight. Anybody who's not familiar with me, my name is Clymer. I head up our CISO practice for Inversion 6. Been there about the last 7 years, been kicking around in IT and IT security for a couple of decades. Our practice does a CISO for hire business. So basically myself and the folks on the team, we're dealing with this every day. We're functioning as security officers for our customers, and we are dealing with the fun cyber insurance renewals a couple times every month, which is one reason it's become a topic for me, whereas a lot of folks, it's once a year. I have with me here as well Lacy, who is heads up the cyber insurance practice for Oswald. Is cyber insurance broker, is my broker, frankly. As a VP over at Oswald, and she's incredibly knowledgeable about this area, knows a lot about the carriers, knows a lot of the struggles and the pain that we're all going through, is kind of our SME on the insurance side. So thank you for joining us, Lacy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Charlie McVan, he heads up GRC for Echo Health. So he's director over there. Echo Health, if you're not familiar, they're a payment processor in the healthcare vertical, process over $100 billion in payments annually. Company's headquartered here in Cleveland, do a lot of really interesting things, have a lot of great things they do for security. And Charlie, he's got oversight, deals with this insurance space and that GRC role, as well as having responsibility for fraud, for audit, having security compliance oversight, and just having his hands on a lot of stuff there, and has gotten to go through the wonderful fun of cyber insurance renewals in his role there. So thank you for joining us, Charlie.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So with that, I wanted to dive in. I'm going to start off and give just kind of my take on what's going on in the space, and then dive into a couple of questions for the panel. So there's a reason why I'm talking about this. I've had to become an amateur cyber insurance expert the last couple of years because it keeps coming up. It used to be this thing, a couple decades ago, even 10 years ago, we would have cyber insurance policies and you would get almost no questions from the carrier, right? You would buy this thing, it didn't cost that much. I remember as a CISO kind of looking at that and going, shouldn't they care a little bit more? Don't they want to do a risk assessment? Don't they want to know more about what I'm doing in my environment? And the answer was no. And the reason was I didn't understand insurance that well, right? I knew security, I knew how to harden the environment, but they're looking at it from an actuarial perspective. They're saying, look, we're not really paying much money out. So why am I going to invest a lot of time and effort in assessing how good you are at security when I'm not really paying out on these policies? So the policies are fairly cheap. They ask a few questions each year, maybe a little more. And then what happens over the last couple of years is bad guys figure out some really great new ways to monetize attacks, and ransomware becomes a thing. And a lot of companies aren't ready for this. They're missing basic controls. Bad guys get in. They're able to encrypt a lot of files on the network. People don't have good backups, or their backups have been deleted. And, well, hey, I've got this cyber insurance policy. It says it's going to cover me. So I call up my broker, call up somebody like Lacy, and hey, let's do something about that. And it was great because those insurance carriers, they would pay the ransom, maybe they would help us deal with all the costs and the cleanup. And I'm in a really great spot, except I'm not the only one. Lots and lots of other companies are having the same problem. The carriers are paying out all this money, and that results in the carriers realizing, oh no, we've got a problem on our balance sheets. We need to understand this better. And that is why a lot of you have seen these questionnaires that have been getting more and more detailed. It's why you're seeing these companies run BitSight and security scorecard on you. And it's why they're getting very, very detailed and specific in their questions, because they're really worried that you're going to fall victim to a ransom and cause them to spend a bunch of money, which they no longer have to spend, right? This thing has become a big drain on them. From my side, I've seen that leading to a lot of last minute deployments, right? Hey, it's renewal time. Your policy expires in 4 weeks. By the way, you don't have MFA on your external applications or inside of your network. Could you get that done in 4 weeks? And that's obviously a nightmare for those of us in IT. Roll out, EDR and MDR in that time, same thing. So that is why Lacy and I have talked a lot, because I try to get ahead of that, because I don't like surprises. Rates keep going up. Even those of us who are doing a really good job at security, right? That's frustrating. Why do my rates keep going up? Because collectively, this space is costing them a lot of money. So, okay, you can get a policy because you're doing better, but your rate's going to go up because overall the sector's kind of affected. So that's Chris's take on it. Lacy, I'm kind of curious, what would you maybe expand upon there, add to kind of my CISO's take on what's going on in this world?
Yeah, absolutely. No, bring up a lot of great points. I mean, I think it's important to note that cyber insurance is something where it's still a fairly immature product when compared to, say, property insurance, which has been around for hundreds of years. So, when the product first came out, it was really a result of technology errors and omissions and more of that liability. And then the coverage just sort of became broader and broader and broader. When the coverage first came out, it was really extensive questionnaires. It was very labor intensive to underwrite. It's very expensive. And then claims were not as expensive as they thought it was going to be. It became a little easier to underwrite, or at least they thought. And I think we've obviously, the pendulum has swung in the complete opposite direction, and it's almost back to where we started again. So I think the good news is ransomware claims, we're really not seeing them as much. I think it's a couple different things. I think the carrier's pushing stronger controls, and it's really forced a lot of companies to, if they weren't taking cyber security seriously, I think it really forced them to. If they wanted to have coverage, if they needed it from a contractual standpoint, they had to have it. And I think now we are seeing more stabilization. However, we're still seeing phishing scams. We're still seeing business email compromise and ransomware. It still exists. It's not an issue. I don't think it'll ever go away. But I think companies are getting better at cybersecurity. But I think on the flip side, the bad actors are going to get more creative, which we've seen that in some recent issues. But I think getting ahead, to your point, Chris, using tools like external scans and how the insurance carriers are viewing from a risk standpoint, they're trying to leverage technology, whether it's an insurtech that's already has that technology built in and they're using it as part of their own, this proprietary scanning technology, or using a tool like BitSight or Security Scorecard or some other type of tool, and really understanding how does the market see you, and working to improve those scores is really important. And then obviously having all the controls that are necessary to obtain coverage. Really, many of them centered around multi-factor authentication, but then looking at some additional controls as well. I'm sure we'll get into that later, but those like nuanced things that need to be in place.
I want to kind of take something specific you said there and kind of make it an action item for IT people. When you talk about understanding how you're seen by BitSight and Security Scorecard, very specifically, if you can run BitSight and Security Scorecard scans earlier in the year before you're going to go through your renewal, you're going to have an idea what your carrier is going to see. And you might even ask your broker, okay, which carriers are we going to go after and what tools do they run? You might be able to, I think we've done some free scans that those carriers were able to do for us, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's part of the reason that we've invested in and partnered with BitSight, because we were having the same issues. Our clients perhaps didn't have access to resources like BitSight, but there are some carriers that can do it complimentary if your broker doesn't have access to these tools, or some carriers that can do it as well. But it's like a consumer credit report, but for cybersecurity. So it's a way to verify. It is not perfect. I like to just essentially say it's like looking at a house, right? You can see in the windows, you can see in maybe some windows and doors, but you have no idea what's behind the walls and what kind of security measures, but it's an indicator, right? So if the score is really low, usually indicates that there's some things going on there, or cybersecurity is not as good as it should be.
Sure. I'm curious, Charlie, from your side. So I've kind of given my take. Lacy's given hers. As a consumer of this stuff, kind of what's your view on how this has changed for you the last couple of years as somebody who's been buying cyber insurance?
Sure. I think it's like, well, what's the next thing? What's the next thing that the carrier is going to want to see and make sure that's in place? At Echo, we have a very supportive senior leadership staff who, if a case can be made for something, we're going to do it. We're going to put it in place, and that doesn't mean everything, but majoritively, we're able to put a lot of these solutions in place and really get that support. However, as much we've already alluded to, it doesn't mean our rates are going down. They're just going up less than some of the other ones. You're still going to get a bit of an increase, or sometimes a large increase. So I think that the challenge for us is, as it becomes more and more expensive, to make sure that we have the coverage that we indicate to our clients, et cetera, that we have, making sure that that balances out with some of the tools and things that we're asked to be put in place.
Okay. No, that mirrors what I've kind of been through as well. I'm seeing, I've got a question that's coming in here. I'll throw this to both of you. The question is, what are the biggest purchases you've seen driven by insurance the last 2 years?
Charlie, I'll let you start there.
Sure. So for Echo, luckily, I've been with Echo about 3 years, and multi-factor was everywhere already. So that was a big, not only a box check. We know it's the blocking and tackling and the thing you just have to do, and you push through that cultural challenge that it likely is for all of us. But luckily, that was already there, bought in. There's an expectation. Everything that we use has multi-factor. So that wasn't one that needed to be overcome. I think some of the optionality, certainly during our renewal this year, it was around EDR and the expectation, maybe not the expectation, but it's really good to see if you have a 24/7 managed SOC. Requirement, no, it is very expensive and it can be very challenging to do so, and you have to get creative with it. But at the same time, back to my earlier point, just around the supportive nature of if we can make a case for it, and just working with our security teams, our infrastructure team, to understand what load could potentially come off of them if we partner with someone who is a partner, can really actually help be mutually beneficial. But so I would say those are the two biggest purchases or incurred costs, I would say, over the last couple of years as it relates to going through getting coverage.
Yeah. I would say a lot of our clients have struggled with multi-factor authentication, because we need in multi-factor authentication, I think everybody knows what it is, but it's something something you have. So you've been using it for years, right? Your debit card and then your PIN, for an example. But with multi-factor authentication, it's really critical areas are email, remote access, privileged access, and also now we're starting to see applications, third parties, anyone, those types of things as well. I think a lot of clients could check most of those boxes, but maybe where they struggled was that privileged account implementation. I've seen that be a bit of a challenge for a lot of clients. Some of the stuff, it doesn't necessarily have a cost for multi-factor authentication. It's just more turning it on, and I think more of a cultural shift. And I think a lot of companies struggled with that. The endpoint detection and response, ideally managed endpoint detection and response, that MDR tool, is really something carriers want to see with some sort of 24/7 SOC managed by a third party. Also, backups a lot around that, and they ideally want to see them to be immutable, encryption of data, sometimes there's cost, sometimes it's just more configuration, service accounts and domain admin access. A lot of it is just kind of looking internally and evaluating what you have. Does it need to be configured that way? It could be password complexity as well. And if you don't have a privileged access management tool, have you looked at the complexity of your passwords? Is it still 8 characters? Could it be more than that? How often do you rotate it? So things like that, we're seeing really that kind of push for the compensating controls, and really understanding what's in place and how our clients can best manage that as well.
Okay. And one thing it's interesting to me, it's probably fun for you to hear me, like, as I'm talking about insurance stuff, because I've had to learn it. And as I'm hearing you go through that, Lacy, something that strikes me is, great, you're a broker and you're talking about all these technical IT things, right? I mean, a few years ago, I'm going to guess things like EDR and backup strategies, like this probably wasn't a conversation you were even having. Is that a fair assessment?
Not to the extent I am now. No, I definitely, I've had a pretty steep learning curve here over the past couple of years. And actually, I wrapped up a certificate program with Carnegie Mellon, which has helped a lot. Just doing a deeper dive into it, just because I have a lot of ground to cover myself, just being able to. And I think my role has shifted quite a bit. Obviously policy language is really important, but also being that conduit and being able to be that bridge sometimes between finance and IT is really my role as well. So yeah, I think the role of the broker is very much consultative, and you need to have somebody who is able to be technical and really be that in-between person to help.
Yeah, I feel like for folks like Charlie and I, we need to understand a lot more about your world than we did a couple years ago. And conversely, I want a broker who understands a certain amount about my world and I think some are better than others, right? That's kind of my nugget here is and I'm biased because you're my broker and I know you know this stuff, but I would say to anybody, whoever you're using to get cyber insurance through, I think you want a broker that understands some of these IT things, because I have those kind of talks where people tell me, the broker is just kind of throwing over whatever the carrier asks for, and there's not a value add, and they don't understand what the carrier is asking for. And so when the customer is confused about those questions, right, everybody is it's like the blind leading the blind. I think we need to be educated on this stuff on our side. You need to be educated about our stuff, but we all at this point have to kind of work together to get the best deal we can from carriers.
Yeah, I think some of the conversations that we've been having lately, the application asks very specific questions. And I have found that most IT folks cannot answer them definitively or are reluctant to identify or to answer those definitively. So how do you have a conversation and really convey all the positive things or the compensating controls that you're doing? So having either a one-on-one underwriting call, getting to know your underwriter, or having an underwriting presentation has been an effective tool to convey all of those great things, because sometimes nobody has any idea all these great things that are happening. So being able to have those conversations and communicate with them, will, I think, help in the long term, and also help build a relationship as well.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Charlie, I'm curious on your side. So talked a lot about how this world's changed. I'm curious, over the last couple of years, all this stuff that's changed, right, in the world, and the scrutiny and the different tools. Do you feel like anything's changed for you and your organization in just how you approach cyber insurance? Just who's involved in the process, the things you're looking for, the conversations you're having with leadership, with your broker. It's a very open-ended question, but I'm just kind of curious, do you feel like the process has changed on your side?
I think it's a much more involved process, as we've heard from a number of different, Chris from your side and Lacy from your side, but also from our side, right? The kind of the one-on-one meeting with potential carriers and kind of putting that presentation together with compensating controls. Hey, we don't have this, but by the way, ABC, XYZ, here are the tools that we're utilizing. Here's how we're utilizing them. I think it's that has definitely been a something that not only helps us, it also gives our internal team a little an opportunity to brag a bit. Here's all these tools, and here's all the really good things that we are doing. And no, we don't have this one specific thing maybe right now. Here's how we're working towards it, but here's how we're going to kind of overcome that. I think the biggest thing beyond that is having a team that understands kind of, Chris, what you were saying. Everybody needs to know a little bit about what everybody else in the process is doing. So our finance, our CFO needs to know a little bit more, maybe just a single layer down as it relates to the technically what is that thing that they're asking for? What does that mean, and how does that actually help us? Same for our IT security folks, and same for our executive leadership team when they see another increase coming through. Well, I thought, last year we did ABC, XYZ, and so then it's the role, then it's to me to translate some of the things that have been provided. Like this is the market. This is what is happening, and although we're not going to put figures on it, the increase would have been worse had we not gone through the things that we do. They're tough conversations. It's not easy. There isn't necessarily good news when you're saying, yeah, it went up by X, but it would have been X plus Y. So do you feel good about that? But there's also an understanding as I think as Lacy alluded to, the potential that some of the things might be stabilizing, or some of the, maybe not as much ransomware, but it's still obviously the phishing and the business email compromise. So I think it's just that collective communication and education of pieces and parts of the process internally and externally.
Yeah, I think too, to your point, Charlie, not every organization has had an enterprise-wide involvement with the insurance process. So I've definitely seen a shift. Now, some larger organizations, they may have the resources and they have, whatever, they may have their own dedicated CISO or something like that, but maybe they're only involved for a blip in the conversation. I think an effective to have a good process for renewal and to have an effective presentation to the market, it needs to be enterprise-wide. It's not just an IT issue. Previously, maybe I would only communicate with finance or risk management, but really when we have a good comprehensive renewal and everybody's on the same page, we generally have all the stakeholders involved. So we need to have somebody from IT, cybersecurity, we need to have somebody from finance, maybe legal needs to be involved. It just needs to be a conversation. And I think too, when IT and cybersecurity is involved in cyber renewal, it also is clearer, and maybe they can understand the resources available with the policy, what can or cannot be taken advantage of, what would be interesting, and then also being aware that you have a cyber insurance policy. So if something happens, okay, this is who I need to call. This is when I need to elevate to senior leadership, and this is when I need to involve the insurance carrier. And I think when that all comes together, it's a smoother process for everyone.
I would add to that how important it is to have a partnership with a broker, because the ability to have someone like yourself and or your team to be able to field calls and talk through things and like, hey, are we engaging our policy? Is this a good move? Should we do this? And then working through strategies of exactly what you just said as it relates to a decision tree. If things are happening, and then making sure that it's the executives who are involved or would be making a call understand what this would look like, and doing some role playing. If X happens, here's what's going to happen. Here's what you can expect. Here's what we do. We're going to be calling, we're going to be calling the broker. We're going to be calling Lacy and team and making sure that is this what we want to do, and making that determination. Again, it comes back to education, kind of the process overall and what it looks like, because we all know when an incident happens, everybody wants to do something, but that's not always the right thing, because then you have this person reaching out to this firm and this person reaching out to that and this person trying to fix that thing. And if you don't have a collective plan that you've talked through, it's going to go sideways in a hurry. But hopefully none of us have fully experienced that, but we definitely have seen how that can happen.
And it just tag on there. I mean, what I'm hearing there is we're making this part of our incident response planning and testing. So if anybody's not rolling in there, you might consider that. And to take a step back, something I heard you both say a minute ago, you talk about this idea of presentation. So I think what you guys are referring to is we all get these questionnaires and you can just fill out the questionnaire and send it back. But I think what you both talked about is that's great, but let's try to go beyond that, set up a presentation with some of the carriers to specifically highlight the things we do that are great outside of the general questionnaire they're going to send. So I'm not just limited to that.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody who's not pursued those things, I think those are really good value adds. I have a question that came in for you, Charlie. I've got my own take on this. I've gotten this one a couple times as well. So I'm curious your take on it. The question is, with all the pain here, with rates going up, even if we do a good job on security, have you ever had a discussion about simply not carrying cyber insurance? It's more trouble than it's worth.
So no, and yes. The idea of it, yes, but the long and short of it is we're contractually obligated and we're not going to risk violation of our contracts for that. So there was an expectation. We have some very large, very large clients, and it's a requirement to do business with them and limits of such. So now, have we had discussions on how can we be creative? Is there a different approach that we can make? Is there something else that we can do? Is there a way to limit potentially the coverage, because the cost is very prohibitive? And so the thought, yes. In actuality, no. And I think it's just very difficult, back to what I was saying earlier around how tough it is to have that conversation with an executive team who is fully supportive and is spending a lot of money on cybersecurity kind of across the board, and then still to come back with well, we did good, but by the way, it's still going up. So I think there's certainly ongoing, maybe not growing, but ongoing frustration with that. But again, it comes back down to the ability to educate them. Some of what we kicked it off with. Why are things increasing? Why is it more? Attacks are increasing, payouts are increasing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So long-winded way of saying we wouldn't actually consider that, but it's one of those, of course, the thought has come up.
Now, I'll add, I probably have a half dozen CIOs who have asked that question to me, right? Hey, Chris, do we really need this? And everything you just said, that's the dialogue. Usually there's a contractual requirement. If there's not, but what if we did have an incident? Don't we want the backstop? Do you really want to pay out of pocket? Yes, we do a good job in security, but bad things can still happen. So I feel like more and more I'm getting that question of, do we need to have this? And I can't think of a single instance where we've said, yeah, we don't really need to carry this anymore. But I think it's going to keep coming up, right? Prices are going up. I got to do more to retain it. But yeah, I still want to have it. Or in your case, right, I don't get a choice. My customers say I have to. I think your job's pretty safe, Lacy.
Yeah. There was a graph recently, which maybe we can share it afterwards, where it kind of showed pricing, and it's been over since like 2016, a very level. And then we hit 2020 and it just spiked, and then it's going down a little bit. So, I think good news is historically it's been pretty good. I've had a lot of good news that I've delivered. It's just the past couple of years, it's been really rough all around, and not just for me, but just for everyone, right? Having to cut the checks for the insurance premiums and go through the process. Like, it's been tough. I think one of the nice things is we've been able to form a closer partnership with our clients, just because it's been a heavy lift all around. But yeah, it's been really rough, and I have empathy for everyone. And even, within Oswald companies, I have to deliver bad news and to, make tougher controls. And, everyone needs to be, unfortunately, kind of working towards that goal. But hopefully we're all getting safer as a result. I think that is one of the nice, one of the nice things that has come about from this is more of a focus on cybersecurity and good cyber hygiene. So I guess that is one of the benefits that we've received, right? But unfortunately, it's been a really rough and very bumpy road getting there.
Yeah, that is a positive. As a CISO, part of me is thrilled. Like, I hate this conversation, but I got all these new toys, right? All these things I probably already wanted to do are getting funded. Cyber insurance has been really good there, and that's another reason I've learned a lot about it. Because it has probably been the biggest driver of security budgets I've had the last couple of years. I hate to say it, but regulatory and other outside forces tend to be the drivers for investment. Absent those things, we don't spend the money. And that's a lot of this problem has been. Verticals like manufacturing historically were pretty lightly regulated when it came to cybersecurity. So not that they didn't care, but at the end of the day, when it comes to making big 6- and 7-figure investments or returning a little more value to the stockholders, yeah, it's well, we haven't had a breach yet. Why are we going to go spend all that money? And then this problem came along, and a lot of those organizations, right, they were a little surprised, I think, that they were maybe farther behind than they thought they were, and had to make investments that other people had made in finance and other verticals.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Lacy.
I was just going to say one of the things that I have seen, unfortunately, lately, to your point about maybe not making the investments or looking at data, there's been some really interesting / scary lawsuits actually and regulatory investigations that I've been seeing recently with really more the executives of the companies and not making those investments in cybersecurity, and starting to see the FTC and some other regulatory bodies take note and actually investigating and bringing action against those executives. So I think on the flip side of it is, to your point, Chris, maybe not making it because you wouldn't necessarily have those regulatory drivers, but or some companies where it's security by obscurity, right? Who would want to come after me, an XYZ company in Northern Ohio? Why would I be a target? But we're starting to see regulators go after that, especially if they've been blasé about privacy data, right? Certainly saw wrongful collection of data is something that's coming up quite a bit. And the carriers are starting to pull back on it and making sure, especially when we have things like consent, tracking cookies, things like that. When we start to see that shift, it's privacy is really becoming more of an issue, and companies that are blasé about it or they're not paying attention and taking note of it like they should, we're starting to see regulators really bringing action against them, which I think is scary. And it's a little bit of an overlap too with directors and officers liability policies in cyber. And, it's something that really should be something taken seriously. And it's great to see at Echo, you've got that tone at the top. I think unfortunately, sometimes we don't always see that. And so cyber insurance has sort of pressed that, but there's still some companies that maybe aren't taking it as seriously as they need to, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it's I think it probably changes the calculus when you feel like you can be held liable personally, for sure. And the target thing's interesting because, if I'm a bad guy, I'm not gonna go after Bank of America with my ransomware or phishing attacks, right? I mean, they're gonna get the shotgun stuff there, but if I'm choosing somebody as a target, I mean, the bad guys are just as knowledgeable as a group of us here on who's likely to be a better target. They're probably going to go after mid-market. They're probably going to go after people in unregulated verticals and that are likely to not have invested quite as much in security. So it's probably not going to be that Fortune 500 everybody knows company. It's going to be a mid-market because they know their chances of success are going to be higher, and especially not to keep picking on manufacturing, but that vertical, the overall revenues can be pretty high, right? So I've got a small IT department. I've got nobody in security. But overall, I'm a $2 billion, $3 billion business. That's a lot of money to pay a ransom. So those are great targets for the bad guys. And the same for the business email compromise and other fraud stuff that's starting to take the place, I think, of the ransomware. those are, yeah, the why would I be a target? That's exactly who somebody's probably going to target. I'm curious, Lacy, another one for you. So we've talked a lot about the stuff that we've kind of been pushed to do. The question I ask you, I think, pretty much every time we talk is, what do you think is coming down the pike, right? What does it, what's your crystal ball look like if you look at things that the carriers are starting to push on, things that have maybe been asked about that you think are likely to go from we're curious to you're going to need to have this in 2023?
So I think it used to be companies that were in the large middle market or kind of more of that national account space. We're starting to see where that's being pushed down into middle market and lower middle market as well. So they want to see privileged access management or PAM tools implemented. That wasn't necessarily something that I had a requirement for, a couple $100 million company before, but we're starting to see that where they want to see it. They have expectations. I mentioned it, the SOC earlier, but 24/7, externally managed SOC. And I mentioned the service accounts, but that is something where, two carriers in particular are really hyper focused on service accounts. One has zero tolerance for it, and one has a little bit of tolerance for it. But the reason that they're concerned about service accounts with domain admin access is because they're seeing claims in that space. And I know we're talking about, I don't mean to keep talking about operational technology and manufacturing, but operational technology has been something where oftentimes it hasn't been a focus. So, treating those environments like the IT and, your corporate network is important too. So, whatever you're doing on your corporate network, it needs to be also in your operational technology environment. So really kind of that focus around that area. We're starting to see a little bit of pushback or pullback from the carriers too on coverage restrictions. So, does it make sense to get a cyber liability policy that's specific to property damage or something like that? So starting to see those, but really carriers getting very specific with those applications and asking really pointed questions.
And I think you've mentioned too, as we've talked outside of the product stuff, I think you've said carriers are asking things like what third-party vendors have access to environments. That comes up too.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions around third parties. Systemic risk is a concern. Managing that is really difficult. And you think about it, insurance carriers have their own insurance that they need to go through. They have reinsurance, and their insurance carriers are asking them, what is your exposure if, say, AWS goes down or one of these others? So they want to understand, what is that systemic risk? And so from that standpoint, they're looking at that very closely, that systemic risk, either from a security failure or a system failure. A lot of them are pulling back on that dependent business interruption, because as we outsource the function, I always like to tell clients you're outsourcing the function, not the liability. But as we outsource the function, if they're down, they can actually affect your ability to do business. And your cyber policy, depending on the language, can actually offset that business income loss. So as we become more interdependent, as we go to the cloud, which is just really having your data on somebody else's network, right? So as we do that, we're more susceptible to these systemic risks and having these broader conversations about aggregation issues and how could it affect multitude policyholders and really become one of these catastrophic events. And that's what the carriers are really hyper focused on, and why they're asking questions around third parties and do they have access to your network? Could they transmit malicious software to you? Or if they have your data and it's compromised, what is their total exposure? So those are some of the areas that they're hyper focused around. I think too, something that is oftentimes overlooked, we already talked about a little bit, I think incident response plans briefly, but some easy kind of low hanging fruit that most companies can do is update your incident response plan, and then also have something in there about contemplating ransomware. How do you elevate? When do you decide to elevate that question on reporting, et cetera? Do you have the broker's information? There are some easier things that you can understand, recovery time objectives and things like that.
That's interesting in there to take one piece of that. So I think you're saying if I have an Amazon or Atlassian or Microsoft outage, I actually might be able to get insurance or coverage through my cyber insurance that helps me with that kind of an event.
Yeah, and there's actually coverage if you want. Most of us are using, there's 5 major cloud providers, right, for hosting. Most of us don't have our own private networks that we're dealing with cloud providers. And you can get, so it's really based on their outage times. There are some coverages that you can get, and they monitor and can reimburse in real time, which is nice if you have contractual liability and obligations. Most insurance cyber policies have waiting periods. It can be anywhere from 6 hours to 24 hours plus, depending on the company size and the carrier. So you want to consider that, really the downtime and what your organization can tolerate from a downtime perspective. But there is coverage out there that's specific to just cloud providers and that outage downtime. But your cyber insurance policy can also contemplate a dependent business interruption, because a cyber policy really fills a valuable gap in coverage between a property and a business income loss, and a non-physical business income loss. So a property policy would respond like fire, tornado, something of that nature, and cyber policy would respond to a non-physical business interruption. So it could be, could be a system failure or could be a security failure.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because more and more, a lot of us are largely remote and dependent on those services, and I think it makes sense to be a growing area.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're coming up on time here. I wanted to wind down here with one last question, and I'll lead off. So, for each one of us to maybe give a tip for cyber insurance buyers for the next year, and the one I have is find a good broker, talk to them early and often, right? I've mentioned I talked to Lacy pretty often, several times here. It's one of the reasons why we're all getting together today. That's been huge, and it's helped me to solve all these other problems and just get ahead of them. This thing where it's a month before renewal and you find out you've got to go deploy some, 6-figure, 7-figure technology that you don't even have yet. It's a nightmare. So find a good broker, talk to them as early as you can. Charlie, I'm curious on your side, what would be maybe one piece of advice you would give folks to think about for next year when they're getting ready for their renewal?
Sure. Well, my number one would be what yours was, which is find a good broker. I'm just going to add on to what you shared. It's the person that you want to help with the tough conversations that you have. It's the person that you want, if something goes wrong, to kind of be the, wait, should I do this? Should I do that? It's a really good sounding board. We're never going to be as educated in this space as they are. So that's definitely what I would share. I guess beyond that, it's back to that presentation. So if you are going through renewal, just be thinking about it, and again, think about it in a way to let your security team and your operations team, et cetera, kind of brag on what it is that you're doing to make sure that you are secure, to make sure that the data that you've been entrusted to hold is safe and secure. Because to Lacy's point, a lot of times you're going to get a very specific question, and those very specific questions are based upon claims that they're paying, right? They're addressing a very specific thing that is happening. However, sometimes just answering that doesn't paint the full picture. Just because I might have a service account with access that, yes, I'm going to address that or whatever, but you didn't give in the yes or no the ability to say, but by the way, everything is multi-factor, the passwords are rotated, they are unknown, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many things that you can help paint that the more holistic picture when there are things that you might need some more time to address. So I think definitely working on some slides or a presentation, and Chris, this is something I think you've definitely helped with, is just really being able to paint that picture of what are the good things that that we're doing. So that's what I would share.
That's great. Thank you, Charlie and Lacy. Charlie and I are both clearly going to call you. So your answer can't be call Lacy. So I'm curious, what would you add?
Yeah, I think it's having a conversation and deciding, you know, have you looked at, have you done some sort of scan, right? Because some of them take some time, and sometimes the carriers identify something, they may say, well, we're not going to consider you for at least 60 days. So having that, how does the external world view you? And really taking a look at that and evaluating, and what can you improve, right? A lot of that's low hanging fruit, I think, and probably doesn't have a big dollar associated with it. And then understanding what kind of cadence you should check in with your broker and what's right for you. Obviously, Charlie and Chris want to know a lot more about insurance than most folks do. So, you know, if you don't want your broker bothering you all the time, then understanding what kind of cadence, what kind of check-ins. But I think having some sort of scan, understanding how the world views you, and then starting early on your renewal. I think the earlier you can, and having those check-ins is really important, because it's going to help you decide, both from a budgetary standpoint, what you need to do, especially if it's already a struggle, maybe culturally with your organization to get that buy-in, or to get access to those tools. Sometimes it just takes some time to implement as well. So I think however you can form your partnership, and then if you haven't done some sort of onboarding call or had some sort of conversation too with your carrier about the process, or if you don't understand the process, I think it's a worthwhile time and investment, or at least having that conversation with your broker. If we had this, who do we call, or do you know who to call? Because it never happens at a convenient time. It's usually on the weekend or something like that. Nobody wants to mess with it. So hopefully no one ever has some circumstance that pops up. But if you do, you want to be able to get a hold of the people who are going to be able to help you quickly and efficiently.
Absolutely. No, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate the time for both of you, Lacy, Charlie. Appreciate all the questions that everybody's been kind enough to share. As a follow-up kind of housekeeping here, we'll be sending out a recording of today's webinar for everybody. If you want to look at that offline, if you want to share that with folks, in your organization. And if you have any follow-up questions that we weren't able to get to today, please feel free to send that as a response when we kind of send the follow-up emails, and we'll do our best to get back to you or connect you with the right individual from the webinar today to give you a good answer. So again, thanks again, Lacy, Charlie, for joining us. Thanks again to everybody, and I think that'll be a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you.